The gun was already in her hand when he walked through the door. Grace Townsend had not survived 2 years alone on the frontier by giving strangers the benefit of the doubt. She had not survived by being slow, by being soft, or by trusting the easy smile of a man who materialized out of a dust storm like something conjured from a dark wish. She had survived by being exactly what she was in this moment, still, cold, and absolutely certain that if he moved one more inch toward her, she would pull the trigger and ask questions of his ghost. The saloon behind her was silent. Even the piano player had stopped. Even the flies had stopped their lazy circling above the spilled beer on the nearest table. The whole shabby room seemed to hold its breath as the man in the doorway let the afternoon light frame him like a portrait of danger. He was tall. She registered that immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a trail-worn coat the color of dried tobacco, and a hat that had seen too many storms. His face was brown from the sun, angular, with eyes that were the precise shade of gray that storms turn right before they destroy everything in their path. He was not ugly. She noticed that too, and resented it in a way that sharpened her grip on the revolver. He looked at her. He looked at the gun. He looked back at her face, and something in his expression shifted, cracked, like the surface of a frozen river when spring finally arrives. "Grace," he said. The word came out of him like it had been held under pressure for a very long time. She did not lower the weapon. "I have been looking for you for 2 years," he said. The saloon remained frozen. Outside, a horse shifted its weight at the hitching post. The wind came down the main street of Redemption, Texas, and moved a tumbleweed past the open door like the world itself was trying to illustrate the moment. Grace Townsend tilted her head by exactly 1 degree. Her voice, when it came, was perfectly level and carried a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "Is that a threat?" His name was Walter Carson, and the look that crossed his face when she said those words was not the look of a man with a dark or hidden agenda. It was the look of a man who had just been struck somewhere vital, somewhere that no bullet had ever reached. He took his hat off slowly, holding it against his chest like he was at a funeral, and she noticed, despite herself, that his dark hair was damp at the temples from the long ride. "No," he said quietly, "it is not a threat." "Then what is it?" He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said, with an honesty so bare it felt almost indecent in that shabby room, "It is the most important thing I have ever said to anyone." The gun did not lower. Not yet. But something in Grace Townsend, something she had buried under 2 years of hardship and secrets, and the particular armor a woman builds when she has survived things she never intended to survive, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for her to understand that whatever was about to happen in this moment was going to change everything again. She had been running for 2 years. She had been hiding for 2 years. And now, standing in a broken-down saloon in a town called Redemption, with a gun pointed at the chest of a man who had traveled an impossible distance just to find her, Grace understood that the story she had been telling herself, the story where she was safe precisely because she was alone, might be the most dangerous story of all. It had started, as most catastrophes do, with something beautiful. 2 years and 4 months before Walter Carson walked through that door, Grace Townsend had been a different kind of woman. Not softer, exactly. She had never been soft. But she had been, in the way of a person who has not yet encountered the full capacity of the world to betray them, more open. She had believed, provisionally, in the possibility of good things. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a merchant who sold dry goods and philosophy in roughly equal measure. Her mother had died when Grace was 11, leaving behind a rosewood hairbrush and the advice, offered in the grip of fever, to trust your own mind above all other counsel. Her father had been kind and distracted, and Grace had educated herself in the back of his shop, reading everything she could lay hands on, developing opinions that were sharp enough to cut, and a stubbornness that her father called a gift, and her neighbors called something less flattering. At 22, she had made the decision that would reorder her life. She had answered an advertisement in the Missouri Democrat, placed by a man named Cornelius Vance, who was seeking a capable woman to assist in managing a cattle operation outside of San Antonio, Texas. The position was described as that of a bookkeeper and household manager. The salary offered was substantial. The opportunity, for a woman with no inheritance and considerable ambition, was remarkable. What the advertisement had not mentioned was that Cornelius Vance was also seeking a wife. Grace had not known this when she arrived in Texas in the spring of 1878. She had arrived by stage, carrying 2 trunks and a ledger she had already begun filling with the questions she intended to ask about the operation of the ranch. She had been met at the stage stop by a man who introduced himself as Hector Graves, Vance's foreman, a quiet man with watchful eyes who had looked at her with an expression she had not then known how to interpret. She knew now that the expression had been pity. Cornelius Vance was 53 years old and had the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no by anything except the weather. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He was simply a man who had decided at the age of 53 that what he wanted was a young wife who was intelligent enough to be interesting and compliant enough to be manageable. He had believed, apparently, that Grace Townsend would prove to be both. He had been wrong about the second part. The first 3 months had been a slow revelation. Grace had done the work she was hired to do, and she had done it well, bringing order to accounts that had been kept with spectacular carelessness. She had identified 2 instances of what appeared to be systematic theft by a supplier in San Antonio, had corrected the records, and had drafted a letter that had recovered $800 for the Vance operation. Cornelius had praised her abilities with the particular warmth of a man who is already planning to own them. The proposal had come in August, delivered over dinner as though it were a business proposition, because to Cornelius Vance it fundamentally was. He outlined the terms. He outlined the benefits. He made it clear, with a kind of breezy certainty that she found nauseating, that he expected her to see the obvious logic of the arrangement. Grace had said no. The aftermath of that no had been instructive in the worst way. Cornelius Vance did not accept no from young women with no connections and no resources in a territory where he held considerable influence. What followed was a campaign of pressure so methodical and so relentless that Grace had understood within a week that she needed to leave. Not just the ranch, the territory entirely. The problem was that Cornelius held her wages. He held them on the grounds that she owed the ranch for the cost of her transport from St. Louis, a debt that he had never mentioned before and that she had never agreed to, but that he articulated with the confidence of a man whose word was local law. Without her wages, she had no money for a stage ticket. Without a stage ticket, she had no way out. It was Hector Graves who had helped her. Hector, the quiet foreman with the watchful eyes, had pressed a sealed envelope into her hand one evening in September and told her that there was a stage leaving from a junction 12 miles north at dawn, and that if she were not on it, he reckoned she would be sorry for a long time. The envelope had contained $40 and a single line in a different handwriting. The handwriting had said, "I am sorry I cannot do more." W.C. She had not known then who W.C. was. She had been too frightened and too focused on survival to wonder at length. She had taken the $40 and she had been on that stage when it left the junction at dawn, and she had not looked back. She had gone to Austin first, then north, moving carefully, always paying cash, always giving a false name at the boarding houses because Cornelius Vance was the kind of man who sent people to find things he considered his property. She had changed her name twice, though never the first part. She was always Grace. She could not seem to give up that small continuity. But she had been Grace Harlow in Austin and Grace Merritt in a small town called Briar's Crossing, before she had eventually arrived in Redemption, Texas, where she had taken a job at the only establishment in town that needed someone who could manage accounts and keep a clear head. That establishment was the Dusty Bell Saloon, owned by a woman named Clara Hobbs, who had arrived in redemption under her own set of mysterious circumstances, and who asked no questions that were not strictly necessary to the operation of her business. Grace had been Grace Townsend again in redemption because she had been tired, and because redemption was small and remote enough that she had believed, with the perhaps excessive optimism of the genuinely exhausted, that no one who was looking for her would look here. She had believed that right up until the moment Walter Carson walked through the saloon door in October of 1880. She still had the gun pointed at him. "Who sent you?" she said. He sat down at the nearest table without being invited, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that sudden movements are inadvisable when a capable woman is holding a revolver. He set his hat on the table and looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "Nobody sent me. I came on my own." "That is not an answer. It is a complete answer. You might not like it, but it is complete." He looked around the saloon briefly, taking in the bartender, who was pretending to polish a glass, and the two cowhands at the back table who were very carefully not looking at anything interesting. "Could we perhaps speak somewhere less public? We can speak right here." He accepted this with a slight inclination of his head. "All right. My name is Walter Carson. I worked for Cornelius Vance as a line rider for the better part of 3 years. I resigned from that position 14 months ago. I'm not working for Vance, I have not been in contact with Vance, and I want nothing to do with Vance except to ensure that he cannot harm anyone else the way he tried to harm you." The word harm landed in the room with significant weight. Grace studied him. She was good at reading people. It was a skill she had developed out of necessity, and she applied it now with the full intensity of 2 years of hard-earned practice. He sat without fidgeting. His hands were on the table, visible, which she noted as a deliberate choice. His expression was open in a way that was either genuine or an extraordinary performance, and she could not immediately determine which. "How do you know what he tried to do?" she said. "Because I was there. Something moved across his face, something that looked very much like guilt. I saw more than I acted on. That is something I have had difficulty living with." She lowered the gun by about 3 inches, not all the way, but 3 inches. "You are WC," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was quiet and steady. "Yes, the $40. I gave it to Hector. I would have given you more, but 40 was what I had readily at hand and time was short." He paused. "I have wondered many times if it was enough to get you clear." "It was," she said, "just." The silence between them had changed. It was still cautious, still charged, but something had shifted in its quality. It was no longer purely adversarial. It was something more complicated, which Grace regarded as its own kind of danger. She put the gun back in the holster she wore under her apron and sat down across the table from him. The bartender, a man named Dix who had the wisdom of the long-suffering, promptly poured 2 glasses of whiskey and set them on the bar without being asked. "You resigned from Vance's operation 14 months ago," Grace said. "Why?" Walter was quiet for a moment. He picked up the whiskey glass that Dix had brought over without ceremony and turned it in his hands without drinking from it. "Because of what I did not do," he said. "Or more precisely, what I allowed to happen by inaction." He looked at her directly. "You were not the first woman Vance pressured. There was another one 2 years before you arrived. A widow named Helen Carver who had come to manage his house. Vance wanted to marry her as well. She refused. She disappeared. The official account was that she left voluntarily." He paused. "I do not believe that account." The silence in the saloon was profound. Grace felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the October wind. "What do you believe happened to her?" "I believe she was driven out in a way that was more forceful than the way he tried to drive you out. I believe the full truth of what happened to Helen Carver is something I should have investigated and did not. Because investigating it would have cost me my position, and at the time, I valued my position above my conscience." His voice was even, but there was a hardness underneath it that she recognized as self-recrimination worn smooth through repetition. "When you arrived and Vance began the same pattern, I saw it clearly. I knew what it led to. And I could not again do nothing. So you gave $40 to your foreman to pass along to a woman you had never spoken to, Grace said. Yes. And then you spent 2 years looking for me. Yes. She regarded him for a long moment. Why? He looked at the whiskey glass. He looked at her, and he said with a directness that managed to be both simple and devastating, because I needed to know you were all right. And because, in the 14 months since I left that operation, I have been trying to do the thing I should have done 2 years ago. I have been trying to find evidence of what happened to Helen Carver. Grace sat back in her chair. The afternoon light through the dusty windows was long and golden, the kind of light that makes even broken things look like they might be worth saving. Did you find it? She said. I found enough, Walter said. Enough to bring to a federal marshal. I have an appointment in San Antonio in 3 weeks. There is a deputy marshal named Aldrich who has been building a case against Vance for land fraud and coercion. What I have gathered in the past year is enough to add a significantly more serious charge. He looked at her. But for the most serious charge, the one regarding Helen Carver, I needed a corroborating account. I needed someone else who had experienced Vance's methods firsthand and lived to speak about them. The shape of it became clear to Grace all at once, and the clarity of it was something she sat with for a moment without speaking. You want me to speak to the marshal, she said. I am asking you to consider it, Walter said carefully. I am not demanding anything. I am not here with any kind of ultimatum. I recognize that you have been hiding, and that coming forward carries risks that I do not bear equally with you. You are the one who would need to stand up and speak. I understand if you choose not to. I only ask that you let me explain the situation fully before you decide. Grace thought about Helen Carver, a woman she had never met, a woman who had disappeared into a silence that the official record had chosen to call voluntary. She thought about the $40 in the envelope. She thought about the months in Austin, the months in Briar's Crossing, the months in Redemption, the particular exhausting vigilance of a woman who is always watching the door. Tell me everything, she said. Start from the beginning. He talked for 2 hours. Dix brought more whiskey, and then coffee, correctly reading the situation as one that had graduated from a crisis into a negotiation. The cowhands at the back table eventually left, and Clara Hobbs emerged from the back room at some point, looked at the two of them, looked at Grace's expression, and retreated without comment. The afternoon light faded through gold into amber, and then into the blue hour that precedes dark. Walter Carson told her what he knew in the methodical, precise way of a man who has been rehearsing the telling for a long time. He told her about Helen Carver, about the weeks of pressure and isolation that had preceded her disappearance, about the ranch hand named Sloan who had been involved and who had subsequently left the territory, about the discrepancies in the ranch records during that period that suggested the payment of something that had been categorized as equipment, and that Walter believed, with substantial evidence, was not equipment at all. He told her about his own shame. He told it plainly, without excuse or mitigation, which Grace found more persuasive than any elaborate justification would have been. He said that he had been 28 years old and afraid of losing the only stable employment he had managed to find in 3 years of drifting, and that he had told himself that he did not know enough to be certain, and that what he had known was that he was not certain enough of his uncertainty to act. He said these things the way a man reads from a document he has read many times and has never managed to make sound better. You were 28, Grace said when he paused. That is not an excuse. I did not say it was, I said it is a fact. It is a different thing. She looked at her coffee cup. How old are you now? 30, he said. She was 24. The gap between them was not remarkable, not for this time and this place, but she registered it as she registered everything, as a piece of information to be filed and considered. Tell me about the marshal, she said. Tell me exactly what he needs. He told her. The deputy marshal named Aldrich had been building his case for the better part of 2 years, working through the federal apparatus that was, in 1880, still sorting out its authority in the territories and the older states that bordered them. The case had multiple components, involving multiple victims, and the strongest component, the one that Walter believed could result in something permanent and significant, was the one involving Helen Carver. But that component required a witness who could speak to Vance's pattern of behavior, his methods, the systematic nature of the pressure he applied. Grace's account, given under oath, could be that witness testimony. "What happens if I say yes?" Grace asked. "We travel to San Antonio together. I will accompany you the entire journey. You will meet with Marshal Aldrich, give your account, and sign an affidavit. The marshal will protect your identity to the extent possible. There may be a trial eventually. If there is a trial, you may be called to testify. That is the risk." He looked at her steadily. "I will not pretend the risk does not exist. I will only tell you that Aldrich believes, and I believe, that the weight of the case is strong enough that Vance is unlikely to survive it intact, legally or socially. His ability to threaten anyone will be substantially curtailed." Grace was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sounds of redemption settling into its evening had begun. The distant laughter from the other end of the street, the horses at the livery, the last of the day's commerce wrapping itself up. She had come to know these sounds in the past months. She had come to find them, if not comforting exactly, at least familiar. And familiar was what she had instead of safe. "I will sleep on it," she said. "You can get a room at the hotel. It is the building with the faded blue door. Tell Eliza Marsh that Grace sent you and she will not overcharge you." He stood and picked up his hat and looked at her with those gray eyes that held something she was not yet ready to name. "Thank you," he said, "for not shooting me when I came through the door." "The night is young," Grace said. Something happened to his face when she said that. Something shifted around his eyes, a brief, involuntary thing, almost a smile but not quite. It was the first time she had seen anything approaching warmth in his expression, and it landed on her in a way she immediately filed away under things to examine later. She watched him leave. She sat at the table for a while after he was gone, with her cooling coffee, and the particular internal disturbance of a woman who has spent 2 years building very solid walls, and has just met someone who appears to have arrived carrying a set of very specific tools. Clara Hobbs materialized at the adjacent chair as though she had been there all along. "Well," Clara said. "Do not," Grace said. "I did not say anything. You were about to say a great deal." Clara Hobbs had arrived in redemption under her own mysterious circumstances and asked no unnecessary questions. She had extended these same courtesies to Grace and had never, in 6 months, pressed her about the name changes or the perpetual watchfulness or the gun she wore under her apron as though it were a standard article of clothing. She was in her late 30s, red-haired, sharp, and possessed of a quality of observation that missed nothing. "He is not what I expected," Clara said. "I did not have any expectations." "Yes, you did. You expected something dangerous and coercive, someone sent by Vance." Clara looked at the door where Walter had been. "That man is not coercive. He is persuasive, which is its own kind of danger." "Possibly," Clara agreed. "Or it might be that he is telling the truth and you need to decide what you are going to do about it." Grace said nothing. Clara poured herself a small measure of whiskey and drank it with the efficiency of someone who does not have time for ceremony. "The question," Clara said, "is not whether he is dangerous. The question is whether staying safe is the same thing as living." Grace looked at her. "When did you become a philosopher?" "I have always been a philosopher," Clara said. "I just usually have the good sense to wait until you are ready to hear it." Grace went to bed that night in her small room above the saloon and did not sleep for a long time. She thought about Helen Carver. She thought about Cornelius Vance, about the cold efficiency of his coercion, about the way power operates when it is never challenged. She thought about 2 years of moving, 2 years of looking over her shoulder, 2 years of being Grace Harlow or Grace Merritt or just Grace without a last name when pressed. And she thought about whether she was tired enough of running that she was willing to do the harder thing. She thought about Walter Carson's face when he said, "I have been looking for you for 2 years," and the way it had looked when she asked if that was a threat. She thought about the $40 in Hector Graves's hand, pressed across the distance of decency at the last possible moment. She thought about the particular quality of his stillness and the guilt he carried without decorating it. At some point, she slept. In the morning, she went to the hotel and knocked on the door of the room Eliza Marsh had presumably given him and said, when he opened the door looking like a man who had also not slept particularly well, "I will go with you to San Antonio. I will talk to the marshal. But we do this on my terms, and I set the conditions, and you agree to them before we leave this doorway." Walter Carson looked at her for a moment, and then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Tell me your conditions," he said. She had 4. First, she would carry her own weapon at all times and would not be asked to surrender it or account for it to anyone. Second, the route they took to San Antonio would be determined by her, not by him, because she had spent 2 years learning which roads were safe and which were not. Third, if at any point she felt that the situation had become unsafe or that the marshal's protections were insufficient, she retained the right to withdraw from the whole arrangement without argument from him. Fourth, he would tell her everything he knew about the case, every detail, every risk, every uncertainty, without editing for what he thought she could handle. He agreed to all 4 conditions without negotiation. She had expected him to push back on at least one. The complete acceptance of her terms was, paradoxically, slightly unnerving. She had built the conditions partly as a test, and a man who agreed to everything without contest was either completely trustworthy or completely strategic. "Why no argument?" she said. "Because your conditions are reasonable," he said simply, "and because I owe you deference in this. It is your testimony, your risk, and your life. I have been asking for something large. The least I can do is not make it larger by contesting the terms under which you are willing to do it." She studied him for 3 full seconds. "We leave the day after tomorrow," she said. "That gives me time to make arrangements with Clara." He nodded. "I will be ready." She turned to leave and then stopped. She turned back and looked at him. "You rode how far to find me?" he considered. "The last 4 months of searching covered most of Central and West Texas. Before that, Austin, then north and east into the Panhandle on a mistaken lead." He paused. "I once spent 3 weeks in a town called Briars Crossing on the basis of someone who thought they had seen a woman matching your description. She had been in Briars Crossing for 6 weeks. They had missed each other then by weeks at most." "You came close," she said. "Not close enough," he said, clearly. She left him standing in his doorway and went back to the saloon to talk to Clara, and she spent the entire walk back with the peculiar sensation of a woman who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just been told she might be allowed to set it down. The preparation for the journey took a day and a half. Grace arranged her affairs with Clara, who expressed exactly the right amount of concern and exactly the right amount of practical encouragement. She packed what she needed into a single canvas saddlebag, which was all she had ever carried since St. Louis. She wrote a letter to her father in Missouri, the first contact she had allowed herself in 14 months, telling him, without many details, that she was well and that she hoped to have better news soon. She also went to the general store and bought additional ammunition, a new pair of riding gloves, and a small but extremely sharp penknife that she tucked into her boot, because some habits are too reasonable to abandon. Walter arrived at the saloon on the morning of their departure with 2 horses, both purchased from the Redemption livery. He had bought her a bay mare with good feet and a sensible temperament, and she could tell by the way he stood with both animals that he had some knowledge of horses. Not the showy knowledge of a man performing competence, but the quiet practical knowledge of someone who has depended on horses for a long time. "Her name is apparently Biscuit," he said, indicating the bay mare. "The livery man said she is reliable and does not spook at gunfire." "Given present company, that is a relevant qualification," Grace said. This time the thing that moved across his face was unambiguously a smile, and it changed his face considerably. She turned away and began checking the mare's tack with businesslike efficiency. They rode out of Redemption on a Tuesday morning in October of 1880, under a sky that was the particular deep blue of a Texas autumn, enormous and clear, and carrying that slight cool edge that suggested the summer had finally admitted defeat. The road south was empty at this hour. The land around them was the dry, beautiful, uncompromising landscape of west-central Texas, all caliche flats and cedar breaks, and distant hills the color of pale smoke. They did not talk much in the first hours. Grace was alert and watching in the way she had learned to be, and Walter Carson rode in a way that she noted, with reluctant admiration, did not interfere with her doing so. He did not try to lead. He rode at her pace. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary speech. They stopped at midday near a small creek where the water ran clear over limestone, and watered the horses and ate the food that Grace had packed: dried beef and cornbread and dried apricots, the practical and portable provisions of someone who has done this before. She divided the food with an even hand, and he accepted his portion without comment. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, after a while. "Something that is not about Vance or the case." He looked slightly surprised, as though this category of conversation was one he had not prepared for. She found that interesting. "I grew up in Kansas," he said. "Near Abilene. My father was a farmer. I was the third of 5 children. I left when I was 19 because the farm could not support 5 children indefinitely, and I was the one who suited going." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been writing since I was 6. I spent 3 years working cattle drives before I settled into line writing work. I read whenever I can find something worth reading. I have strong opinions about maps, which most people find an unusual thing to have strong opinions about." "Maps," Grace said. "Most maps of the Western Territories are wrong," he said, with a sudden conviction that was almost startling. "Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong in places. I have spent 2 years navigating by maps that have mountains on them that do not exist and are missing rivers that are actually quite large. It is a genuine problem." She looked at him. "You became animated about maps just now." He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I did, yes." "I find that I do not object to it," she said, and looked away at the creek and the cedar trees with their shaggy bark and their blue-green needles, and she was aware of something that she identified, with caution, as the very earliest beginning of something she was not ready to name. "Your turn," he said. "My turn. Something about yourself, not about Vance or the running." She considered. "I read everything I can lay hands on. I learned to shoot from a woman in Austin who ran a boarding house, and believed that competence in self-defense was as essential as literacy. I make excellent cornbread, which I am aware is a modest accomplishment, but I am proud of it regardless. I once, in the spring of 1879, stopped a stage robbery by shouting at the bandits with such forceful authority that 2 of them actually rode away before anyone fired a shot." He stared at her. "That last one requires elaboration. It requires more time than we currently have," she said. "But the short version is that confidence, applied with conviction, is effective in a surprisingly wide range of situations." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are remarkable." She looked at him. The word landed with a weight and a directness that were different from flattery, different from the easy compliments of men who want something. He said it the way someone says a thing they have simply observed to be true. "You do not know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know what I have observed," he said. "I reserve the right to amend the assessment as I gather more information." She gathered the remains of their meal and repacked the saddlebag, and stood up and was aware that she was fighting a smile in a way that required effort. They rode on. The 3-day journey to San Antonio was not without its complications. On the second day, they encountered a group of 4 men at a river crossing, who had the particular quality of stillness that Grace had learned to associate with men who were considering their options. She felt it before she saw anything specific: a shift in the air, a quality of attention in the way the men were positioned near the crossing. She said quietly to Walter, Do not reach for your weapon yet. Ride slightly ahead of me." He did, without question, and she kept her hand near her holster as they approached the crossing. The four men were trail hands by the look of them, between positions and running low on options in the way of men between positions with gambling debts. Their leader was a stocky man with a red neck scarf who assessed Grace and Walter with the calculating look of someone doing arithmetic. Grace rode up to within comfortable speaking distance and said, in a carrying voice with the tone of someone who has never entertained the concept of being intimidated, "Afternoon. The marshal's office in San Antonio is expecting us before nightfall. We are running a bit late and I would hate to explain the reason." The mention of a marshal's office was not incidental. The stocky man's calculating arithmetic visibly reached a different conclusion. He tipped his hat. "Safe travels," he said. They crossed the river without incident. Walter waited until they were well past before he said anything. "The marshal's office is expecting us," she confirmed. "Just not necessarily before nightfall today." "That was," he said, "exactly the confidence applied with conviction that you were describing." "I have had practice," she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes and that not-quite smile, and she decided that looking at Walter Carson was something she was going to have to be careful about, because the more she did it, the more her carefully constructed assessment of him as a source of complication threatened to become something else. They arrived in San Antonio on a Thursday afternoon. The city was larger than anything Grace had been in since Austin, a sprawling mix of old adobe and newer wood-frame buildings, a city that had been Mexican and then Texan, and then American and still wore all three identities in its architecture and its streets. The San Antonio River ran through it, low and green in October, and the air smelled of dust and cattle and the corn tortillas being made somewhere nearby, a smell that Grace found powerfully and unexpectedly comforting. Walter had arranged in advance for them to stay at a respectable boarding house on Commerce Street, operated by a widow named Mrs. Patricia Eames, who had a reputation for discretion. He had arranged separate rooms, which Grace noted without comment but with a small private acknowledgement that it had been the right thing to do and that she had noticed it. The meeting with Deputy Marshal Henry Aldrich was scheduled for the following morning. Grace spent the evening in her room, going through in her mind everything she intended to say. She was not frightened, or not exactly frightened. She was the way she had learned to be before anything important, focused, precise, running through contingencies. She went to the window at one point and looked out at the San Antonio street below, at the lamplit figures moving through the evening, at the distant lanterns of the market, and she thought about the fact that in all the running and the hiding and the building of walls, she had not once thought about justice. She had thought about survival. She had thought about distance and time and the safest route to the next safe place. She had not thought about the possibility of something being put right. Walter knocked on her door at 7 o'clock. She answered it and found him holding 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen downstairs, which was the kind of small thoughtfulness that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I thought you might not be sleeping," he said. "I am not," she said. She took the coffee. "Come in. We should go through what Aldrich will want one more time." They sat across from each other in the small room, the lamplight steady between them, and went through it together. He told her everything he knew about Aldrich, who he was, how he operated, what he had told Walter about the case. Grace asked sharp questions and he answered them completely, in accordance with her fourth condition, and she revised her understanding of the case as they talked, fitting pieces together with the practiced clarity of a woman who has spent years keeping accurate accounts. At some point, the preparation was done and they were simply sitting in the lamplight, and neither of them moved to leave. "Are you afraid?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I am wary," she said, "which is different. Fear is a thing that closes your options. Wariness keeps them open." He was quiet for a moment. "You have a very particular way of thinking about things." "Yes," she said, "it has kept me alive." "I know," he said, And there was something in the way he said it, something in the weight of those two words that carried with it the full accounting of his 2 years of searching and his 2 years of guilt and the $40 and the long roads and the wrong leads and the 3 weeks in Briar's Crossing where he had missed her by weeks at most. She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him directly in the lamplight. "Why," she said, "truly, not the case, not Helen Carver, not justice. Why did you look for 2 years?" He held very still. She could see him deciding whether to answer honestly or whether to retreat into the safer ground of the practical reasons, the case, the testimony. He chose honesty. "Because when I gave Hector the envelope," he said, "I thought about you from that moment. I did not know you. I had barely seen you at a distance twice. But I knew what I had failed to do for Helen Carver, and I knew I was doing something, however inadequate, for you, and somehow that became the thing I could not stop thinking about." He paused. "I told myself it was conscience, and it was partly. But it was also that I wanted to know you were all right in a way that felt, eventually, like needing to know rather than wanting to know." The lamplight held between them. The sounds of San Antonio at night came softly through the window. "That is an honest answer," she said. "I am capable of those," he said. "On occasion." She looked at him. She thought about the walls. She thought about what Clara Hobbs had said about whether staying safe was the same as living. She thought about the bay mare named Biscuit who did not spook at gunfire, and the maps that were catastrophically wrong, and the 4 conditions she had set that he had agreed to without negotiation. "I think," she said carefully, "that when this is over I would like to have more conversations with you. Of the kind we had today and on the road. That is, if you intend to remain in the same region." He looked at her with something that was very large and very carefully contained. "I intend," he said, "to be wherever is most useful to you." "That is a diplomatic answer," she said. "It is also an honest one," he said. "The two are not always incompatible." He left at a reasonable hour, and she went to sleep and slept better than she had in 2 years, which she noted upon waking and filed as significant information. Deputy Marshal Henry Aldrich was a compact, serious man in his mid-40s, with a gray-streaked mustache, and the unhurried manner of someone who has spent years building careful structures in the law, and has learned not to rush them. His office was on the 2nd floor of the Federal Building on Main Plaza, a room that smelled of paper and leather, and the particular dust of official records. He received Grace and Walter with the formal courtesy of his office, and the more personal courtesy of someone who had a reasonable sense of what it had cost Grace to be in this room. He offered her coffee and water and the choice of where to sit, and he did not begin with anything about the case. He began by asking if she had any questions about his office and its protections before she said anything at all. She had 2. She asked them. He answered both fully and without qualification. She told him her account. She told it the way she had kept accounts, accurately and completely, with dates and amounts and specific details, without embellishment and without minimization. She told him about the position as described and as found. She told him about the proposal and the no and the subsequent campaign of pressure. She told him about the withheld wages and the manufactured debt. She told him everything she had observed in the 3 months she had been on Vance's operation, the things she had noted in her ledger, and the things she had noted in her memory, because she had understood by the end that the record might matter. Aldrich asked questions that were precise and relevant. He had a clerk who transcribed everything. After 2 hours, he sat back in his chair and looked at his notes and then looked at Grace. "Miss Townsend," he said, "what you have provided today, in combination with Mr. Carson's evidence and the accounts we have gathered from 3 other women in the past year, constitutes a substantial case. I believe we have enough to proceed." "What happens to Cornelius Vance?" Grace said. "In the best case, he faces federal charges of fraud, coercion, and what we are now building as an unlawful confinement case. He will be arrested and brought before a federal judge. Given the weight of the evidence, I believe a conviction is probable." Aldrich paused. What happened to Helen Carver is a more complex matter. We may never have complete certainty, but what we can demonstrate is the pattern of his conduct which speaks to the probability. And the man named Sloan, Grace asked. Aldrich and Walter exchanged a look. Sloan is currently located in Colorado, Aldrich said. He is already the subject of a separate investigation. The two cases are connected. Grace nodded. She stood and extended her hand to Aldrich, who shook it with the gravity the moment deserved. Outside, in the October sunlight of San Antonio's main plaza, Grace stood for a moment and felt the particular sensation of a very heavy thing being set down. Walter stood beside her. He did not say anything. He understood, she thought, that this was a moment that did not require decoration. After a time, she said, "I would like to see the river." They walked to the San Antonio River and followed it for a while, through the dappled shade of the cypress trees that lined its banks, past the old missions in the distance, through the particular beauty of that river valley in October. They walked without hurrying. They talked, gradually, about things that were not the case and not Vance, and not the past 2 years. He told her more about Kansas and the farm and the particular quality of prairie light in late summer. She told him about her father's bookshop, and the books she had read at 13 that had convinced her the world was larger than St. Louis and worth investigating. He told her about the drives and the stars over the open range at night, and the way the geography of the West had changed him in some fundamental way he had never been able to articulate properly. She told him about the stage robbery and the 2 bandits who had ridden away on the strength of her voice alone, and his laughter, when it came, was a genuinely delighted thing that she found herself wanting to produce again. They ate supper at a small restaurant near the plaza, Mexican food, tamales and beans and rice with peppers, and drank cold water because both of them were tired in the bone-deep way of people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have just set it down. The conversation moved between serious and light with a naturalness that was its own kind of revelation. At some point over supper, Walter said, "What will you do now, after this?" Grace considered. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "I think I will go back to redemption for the time being. Clara needs someone who can manage the accounts, and I find that I have a certain fondness for the town." She looked at him across the table. "What will you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have been considering purchasing some land," he said. "There is a piece of land I looked at 2 months ago south of here along the Guadalupe River. Good land, a small house that needs work, the kind of work that takes time and care." He paused. "It is the kind of land a person could grow something on if they were inclined." "Are you inclined?" she said. "Increasingly," he said. And he looked at her in a way that made the statement mean more than land. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "I think that before you purchase land along the Guadalupe River, you might consider coming to Redemption first, for a visit of reasonable duration." He was very still for a moment. Then quietly, "How reasonable?" "That," she said, "could be determined upon your arrival." Something opened in his expression, something unheld and genuine and considerable, and she thought again that this man's face was remarkably different when he was not trying to be careful. "Then I will come to Redemption," he said. They returned to Mrs. Eames's boarding house in the warm October evening, and Grace went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to feel, fully and without guardedness, the strange and unfamiliar sensation of looking forward to something. She wrote to her father that night. A longer letter this time. She told him she was well. She told him that a situation she had been entangled in was being addressed by proper legal authority and that she believed it would be resolved. She told him about redemption and about Clara Hobbs, and she told him, in the cautious and oblique language of a woman still learning to trust her own hope, that she had met someone who seemed, in her assessment, to be a person of genuine quality. She sealed the letter and set it aside for morning post, and went asleep in a city that smelled of river and history and something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like possibility. They rode back to Redemption over 4 days. taking a slightly different route than they had come because Grace felt the landscape warranted it. They stopped at a limestone canyon where the walls were 100 feet high, and the colors ran from gold to rust to a deep burnt orange that was almost too beautiful to be real. They stopped at a settlement where an elderly Apache man and his family were conducting business at the trading post, and Grace, who had made it her practice to treat people as people regardless of what the prevailing sentiment around her suggested, bargained for a piece of beadwork and a jar of pine pitch with the same straightforward respect she brought to everything. Walter watched this and said nothing, but she noticed the quality of his attention. At their camp on the third night, when they had made a fire of cedar and the stars were extraordinary above the open country, and the sound of the horses grazing at the picket line was a soft and peaceful accompaniment to the night, Grace said, "I owe you something." He looked up from the fire. "An apology," she said, "for the gun." "You do not owe me an apology for the gun," he said immediately. "That was entirely reasonable. I pointed a loaded weapon at a man who had spent 2 years trying to help me," she said. "You pointed a loaded weapon at a stranger who walked into your place of work announcing he had been looking for you for 2 years," he said. "Those are different things. You did not know he was trying to help you. You could not have known." She looked at him across the fire. "You are very insistent about not accepting my apology." "I am insistent about the facts," he said. "The fact is that you had every reason for every choice you made from the moment you left Vance's ranch, every single one, including pointing the gun." He paused. "The apology belongs in the other direction." She was quiet. The fire shifted and sent a small column of sparks upward into the dark. "You already gave it," she said. "In the saloon, you gave it without being asked. It was owed." "Yes," she said, "and it mattered, the giving of it." She looked at him steadily. "You should know that." He held her gaze across the fire for a moment that had a particular quality of weight and clarity. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. They arrived in Redemption on a Sunday afternoon to find that the town had the sleepy, well-intentioned quality of a Sunday in October, and that Clara Hobbs, who appeared to have been watching for them from the saloon window, emerged onto the porch with an expression of considerable relief and interest in equal measure. "You are back," Clara said, looking at both of them. "We are back," Grace confirmed. And Clara said, "And the marshal has what he needs," Grace said. "And I am going to need coffee and a bath in that order." Clara looked at Walter Carson for a moment with the assessing look of a woman who misses very little. "Mr. Carson," she said, "will you be staying in Redemption for a period?" "For a visit," he said, "of reasonable duration, as yet to be determined." Clara looked at Grace. Grace looked at Clara. Something passed between them that was the compressed communication of women who have been paying attention to each other. "I will put the coffee on," Clara said, and went back inside. Walter's stay in Redemption extended past a week, and then past 2, and then past the point where calling it a visit required a certain generosity of interpretation. He was useful in the way of someone who knows how to work and does not make a performance of it. He repaired a fence post at the back of the saloon that had been leaning dangerously for months. He assisted the town's only blacksmith, a man named Cole Briggs, with a particularly stubborn wagon wheel, and the two of them became easy acquaintances in the way of men who respect each other's competence. He obtained from somewhere a selection of books that he left on the table in the saloon common room with the casual air of someone who happens to have brought reading material, and Grace noticed that 2 of them were books she had mentioned in passing conversation, and one of them was a better map of West Texas than anything she had seen before. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. But she noticed it, and she filed it in the growing account of Walter Carson that she kept with the same careful accuracy she brought to everything. On a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after they had returned to Redemption, Grace and Walter walked after supper to the edge of town, where the land opened up into the wide, flat darkness of the Texas night. They had been walking together in the evenings when the saloon's business was quiet, establishing a habit that neither of them had formally agreed to and neither of them intended to stop. He stopped at the edge of a fence line and looked at the stars for a moment, and then turned to look at her. "I would like to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been moving in that direction since approximately 2 hours into our ride from Redemption to San Antonio, and I have been certain of it since the night we sat in your room in San Antonio going through the case with the lamp between us. I am not saying this with any expectation or demand. I am saying it because not saying it any longer requires more effort than I am willing to expend, and because honesty seems to be the only currency that has any value between us." She stood in the dark Texas night and looked at him and felt the extraordinary thing that was happening in her chest with the scientific detachment of someone observing a phenomenon they have never encountered before and do not have an adequate framework for. "That is very direct," she said. "Yes," he said. "I find I have run out of patience for indirection." She turned and looked at the stars for a moment. The whole enormous vault of the Texas night, the Milky Way smeared across the black above them like someone had spilled a jar of light, and the particular clean smell of the night air, cedar and grass, and the faint, cool promise of approaching winter. She turned back to him. "I am," she said, carefully and with the full weight of someone who has been very careful for a very long time and is choosing to be otherwise, in the same direction. "I have been moving there since approximately the moment you sat down in the saloon and put your hands on the table where I could see them." She paused. "I want to be clear that I am not certain what this looks like yet. I am not a woman who rushes into certainty." "I know," he said. "I would not ask you to." "But I am also," she said, "not a woman who denies what is true because it is inconvenient." He looked at her in the starlight with everything that he felt visible on his face, uncontained, genuine, and she thought again, as she had thought in the lamplight of her room in San Antonio, that this man's face was remarkable when he was not trying to hold it still. She stepped toward him. He stood very still. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face slightly into her hand, the way an animal leans toward warmth, unconscious and honest, and she felt the roughness of his jaw against her palm and the weight of everything that had led to this moment. She kissed him. He kissed her back with the particular quality of someone who has been patient for a long time, and is now, carefully, being something other than patient. His hands came up to her face with a gentleness that she felt as much as she felt the warmth of him, and the stars were overhead in their impossible extravagance, and the Texas night held them in its enormous quiet. When they separated, they stood close, his hands still lightly against her face, her hands against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "Exactly." The weeks that followed were the best weeks Grace could remember in a long time. They were not without their difficulties. A letter arrived in November from Deputy Marshal Aldrich confirming that Cornelius Vance had been arrested and that the charges were proceeding to federal court. There would be a trial in the spring. Grace's testimony, as Aldrich had carefully arranged it, would be given via affidavit rather than requiring her physical presence in the courtroom, which was a protection she was grateful for. The trial was real and would have real consequences, and knowing that it was happening produced in Grace a complicated mixture of relief and the dull residual fear of something that has threatened you for long enough to leave its mark. Walter was steady throughout this period in the way she had come to rely on. He did not minimize what she felt or redirect it toward something easier. He listened. He asked good questions. He sat beside her in the evening when she was turning things over in her mind and made no demand that she turn them over differently or more quickly. He was also, she discovered gradually, funny, not in a performed or obvious way. In the dry, sideways way of someone who sees the absurdity in things and articulates it at precise moments. He made her laugh in ways that felt like a physical release, like opening a window in a room that has been closed too long. He rode out one morning in late November and came back in the afternoon and asked her to walk with him to the edge of town that evening. She went, because she always went now, and he led her a little further than their usual fence line, to a place where the ground rose slightly and you could see in all directions, the town behind you and the land opening in every other direction like a map of possibility. He said, "I have been thinking about the land along the Guadalupe River." "You have mentioned it before," she said. "I have." He looked at the land around them. "I have been thinking about it in relation to a question I want to ask you." She looked at him. The November night was cold, genuinely cold now, and her breath made small clouds in the air. The stars were brilliant in the cold, clear sky. "I want to ask if you would be willing to be my wife," he said. "I want to ask if you would be willing to build something with me. The house along the Guadalupe needs work, and the land needs more work than that. And I am aware that I am asking you to exchange the relative security of what you have built here for something that requires considerable faith in a future that is not guaranteed. I am aware that you have had good reason to distrust promises and proposals, and the intentions of men who stand before you asking for something large." He was quiet for a moment. She did not fill the silence. "I am asking," he said, "because I love you and because I believe we are genuinely well-suited, and because the thought of not building that future with you is something I find I cannot treat as an acceptable alternative. But I am not asking with any expectation that you answer yes. I am asking because you deserve to be asked honestly, with full knowledge of what is being asked, and full freedom to say no without consequence." Grace stood in the cold November night and looked at this man who had given her $40 in 2 years, and his best honesty and his hands placed flat on a table where she could see them. She thought about 2 years of running. She thought about the walls. She thought about what it felt like to have set down the thing she had been carrying, and what it felt like to have someone beside her who understood the weight it had been without needing her to perform the having carried it. She thought about the house along the Guadalupe River that needed work, and the land that needed more, and the particular quality of building something with someone who does not require you to be anything other than what you are. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and complete, and she meant it entirely. He stood very still for a moment, the way he went still when something large was happening, and then he reached out and took her hand in both of his in the cold night air and held it, and she felt the warmth of him against the cold and the realness of him, and she thought that this was what it felt like to choose something rather than flee from it. They were married in redemption in December of 1880. The ceremony was performed by the traveling minister, who came through the region once a month, and who, upon hearing the request, rearranged his schedule with a cheerfulness that suggested he found the business of marrying people more rewarding than some of the other business he was called upon to conduct. Clara Hobbs served as witness, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched something develop from the beginning and has had the wisdom to let it unfold. Eliza Marsh from the hotel brought a cake. Cole Briggs the blacksmith and Dix the bartender were both present, and Dix produced a bottle of good bourbon from a hiding place whose existence Grace had suspected, but never been able to confirm. Grace wore her best dress, a deep blue that she had kept carefully in the bottom of her trunk through all the moving and all the false names, a dress she had bought in St. Louis in what felt like another lifetime. Walter wore a clean shirt and his least battered coat and had, she noticed, managed to shave with extraordinary thoroughness. She did not cry during the ceremony. She had known she would not. But when the minister said the words that made them husband and wife and Walter looked at her with everything he felt completely unguarded on his face, she felt something shift in her chest that was so complete and so real that it took a moment to accommodate it. They kissed in front of their small assembled company, and Clara Hobbs made a sound of profound and vindicated satisfaction. They moved to the land along the Guadalupe River in January of 1881, packing what they had and making the journey south and west in the cold clarity of a Texas winter. The house was, as advertised, in need of work. It was a 2-room structure of limestone block with a cedar shake roof that had developed opinions about the concept of waterproofing, and a front porch that leaned at an angle suggesting it was tired. The barn was sounder than the house, which Walter pointed out was at least a workable starting point. They spent the first weeks in a focused partnership of repair that Grace found deeply satisfying. She was practical and good with her hands and not sentimental about the work. He was the same. They developed the particular domestic vocabulary of two people who are genuinely compatible in the doing of things, the shorthand of shared tasks, the efficiency of two people who think alike about most practical matters. In the evenings, when the work was done and they had eaten supper by the fire in the front room, they talked about everything, about the farm in Kansas and the bookshop in St. Louis, about the maps that were catastrophically wrong and the books he had found for her, and the ones she intended to obtain, about the trial, when letters from Aldrich arrived in February reporting that the case was proceeding, and that Cornelius Vance was experiencing the particular difficulties of a man whose long-cultivated reputation is being systematically dismantled in a federal courtroom. The verdict came in March. Guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, unlawful confinement, and a charge related to the circumstances of Helen Carver's disappearance that was not murder but was something that would take significant years to serve. The sentence was 17 years in federal prison. Grace read the letter from Aldrich standing at the kitchen table in the limestone house on the Guadalupe River, and Walter was beside her and watched her read it and said nothing until she put the letter down. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she confirmed. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the box she kept under the bed. The box with the letter from her father and the $40 receipt she had written to herself in the stage 2 years ago, her private archive of the things that had led her here. She stood up and went to the window and looked at the Guadalupe River, which was running higher now in the March rain, green and clear over its limestone bed, and the cedar and live oak trees along its bank were the fresh, improbable green of early spring. Walter came and stood beside her at the window. He put his arm around her and she leaned slightly into him, and they looked at the river together. "What do you want to do today?" he said. She thought about it. "I want to plant the kitchen garden," she said. "We are late enough into March that we could start." "I thought we might be getting to that," he said. "I bought seed in town last week." She turned to look at him. "When did you buy seed?" "When I went for the mail," he said. "I had a feeling about March." She looked at him with the smile she reserved for the moments when Walter Carson was exactly himself, which was often and was always, in some way, a small revelation. "You had a feeling," she said. "I find I often do," he said, "about things worth planting." She laughed, and he looked delighted by it, which he always did, as though her laughter was something he was not yet accustomed to having and was determined not to waste. They planted the kitchen garden in the March rain, in the rich dark soil of the Guadalupe bottomland, and the work was muddy and cold and perfectly good. Grace wrote to her father and told him about the marriage and the house and the river and the verdict. Her father wrote back within the month, a letter full of the quiet joy of a man who has been worried about his daughter for 2 years and is now able to believe, on good evidence, that she is well. He wrote that he would come to visit in the fall if they would have him, and Grace wrote back immediately that they would absolutely have him and that he was to bring books. The spring unfolded along the Guadalupe with the extravagant abundance of a Texas spring after a wet winter. The kitchen garden came up well. Walter acquired 2 milk cows and a small herd of cattle, 20 head, which was a beginning. He built a proper corral and repaired the roof of the barn. Grace kept the accounts with the precision she had always brought to numbers and identified 2 efficiencies in their supply arrangements that saved them money they put toward materials for a new porch that did not lean. She rode into the nearest town, a community called Springer's Crossing, once a week for supplies and found herself developing, gradually, the social connections of someone who intends to be somewhere for a long time. The storekeeper and his wife. The schoolteacher, a young woman from Virginia named Miss Hartwell who had come west on her own terms, and who Grace recognized as a kindred spirit in certain respects. The doctor, an older man named Dr. Feeney who was competent and practical, and did not treat women as though their medical concerns were primarily of the decorative variety. In May, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Walter on a Tuesday evening on the new porch, with the Guadalupe visible through the cedar trees in the late light. She told him plainly, because that was how she did most things, and watched his face. He was still for a long moment. Then something happened to his expression that was one of the most complete things she had ever seen on a human face, an overwhelming, quiet, grateful joy, and he reached out and took her hands. "Are you well?" he said. This was the first thing he said, and she loved him for it. "I am very well," she said. "Dr. Feeney says everything appears to be in excellent order. You have already spoken to Feeney." "I went this morning," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." He looked at her with that enormous quiet joy, and he said, "We are going to need more rooms." She laughed. He pulled her toward him and held her with the careful, encompassing strength of someone who is trying to express something the language has not quite provided adequate words for, and she held him back with equal conviction. She carried well through the summer, which in Texas meant she was frequently hot and occasionally less patient than her baseline, which was saying something. And Walter took both these facts in stride with the equanimity that was, she had decided, his most impressive quality. He built the first addition to the house through June and July, a proper bedroom and a small room that could serve as a nursery, working in the mornings before the heat made it impossible, and then working again in the evenings. Her father, George Townsend, arrived in September as planned. He was a thin, kind man with spectacles that were always slightly wrong on his face, and the distracted air of a man who is always thinking about three things simultaneously. He arrived on the stage at Springer's Crossing with more books than could reasonably be attributed to a single visitor, and immediately set himself to being useful in the way of someone who has raised an independent daughter, and understands that being useful is a currency she respects. He liked Walter immediately, and with no apparent ambivalence, which Walter handled with a quiet pleasure that Grace found endearing. George Townsend asked Walter sharp questions about the land and the cattle and the accounts, and Walter answered them completely, and Grace watched her father reassess and reassess across the first 2 days of the visit, and arrive at a conclusion that was legible in his expression as something close to relief. On the third evening of the visit, George Townsend sat on the new porch with Walter and Grace and looked at the Guadalupe River in the September evening and said, "You know, your mother would have been very pleased about all of this." Grace felt the warmth of that settle somewhere deep. "I know," she said. "She always said," her father continued, "that the most important thing was to trust your own mind. But she also said, and I did not quote this to you at 11 because you were 11 and the emphasis needed to be elsewhere, that trusting your own mind includes trusting it when it tells you that someone else is worth trusting." Walter was quiet beside her, but she felt the shift in the quality of his stillness that meant he was moved. "She sounds like she was very wise," Walter said. "She was," George said. "I have missed her every day for 13 years, and I have never met anyone who reminded me of her. Until now." He was looking at Grace when he said it, and Grace felt the particular, profound love of a daughter for a father who has always seen her clearly. Her father stayed 3 weeks and left in October, laden with 2 jars of preserves from the kitchen garden, and a jar of the Guadalupe River honey that a neighbor produced, and that Grace had become slightly obsessive about. He promised to return in the spring. In November, in the limestone house on the Guadalupe River, with the cold rain on the cedar shake roof that Walter had repaired in the spring, Grace gave birth to a son. He came into the world with the robust and emphatic opinion of a person who has been somewhere small for too long and is glad to be in a larger space. Dr. Feeney presided with practiced competence. Walter was present, because Grace had made it clear at the outset that she had no interest in any arrangement where he was not, and he held her hand through all of it and did not faint or make any remarks that needed to be reconsidered, which Grace had recognized in advance as a low bar, and had hoped he would clear it. He cleared it entirely. He was exactly what she needed him to be, which was present and steady, and not requiring her to manage anything other than what she was managing. When it was done and the baby was in her arms, small and red-faced and spectacularly noisy, Walter sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello," he said to the baby in a low and reverent voice. "I am your father. I have very strong opinions about maps. Your mother is remarkable. You should know that immediately." Grace laughed, which hurt, which she ignored. "What do we call him?" Walter said. She had thought about this for months. She had a list, which she had kept in the account book because she kept everything in the account book. She looked at her son, at his dark hair and his unfocused eyes and his furious determination to make his presence known. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas George Carson, for your brother who died on the Kishom Drive and for my father." Walter looked at her. He blinked once in the particular way he blinked when something got through the quiet exterior to the much less quiet interior. "You remembered about my brother," he said. "You mentioned him once," she said, "on the road to San Antonio, briefly." "I did not think you heard that," he said. "I hear everything," she said. "It is a habit I have not broken." He reached out very carefully and touched the baby's head with one finger, the way you touch something precious and unlikely. "Thomas George Carson," he said. "Welcome." Thomas George Carson was, it turned out, a person of tremendous personality and very loud opinions, which he had apparently inherited in equal measure from both parents. He was healthy and growing and fascinated by everything within reach, which by 6 months included things that were, in Grace's assessment, not strictly within reach, but that he had developed creative methods of accessing. Clara Hobbs came from Redemption for a visit in the spring of 1882 and held Thomas for approximately 4 minutes before handing him back and saying, "He is extraordinary and exactly like you, and you should be very proud and also very patient for the next 15 years. Grace accepted both the compliment and the warning. The trial had been done for a year. Cornelius Vance was in federal prison. The man named Sloan had been dealt with by the Colorado investigation and was in a similar position. Deputy Marshal Aldrich had sent a final letter in January of 1882 closing the case formally from his end, and Grace had read it and put it in the archive box and gone out to the new porch and stood in the January air and felt the final settling of something that had been unsettled for a very long time. She stood there long enough that Walter came out and stood beside her. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. "Done." He understood what she meant, because he understood most things she meant. He put his arm around her and they stood in the January cold and looked at their land and their river, and the cedar and oak trees, and the smoke from their chimney and the barn that housed their cattle and the garden that was sleeping under its winter covering. And all of it was theirs, built by their hands and their choices, and a $40 envelope, and 2 years of looking, and the question that had turned out not to be a threat at all. In the summer of 1883, a letter arrived from Grace Townsend in St. Louis saying that he was considering whether to sell the shop and perhaps look into the possibility of relocating, now that his daughter and son-in-law appeared to be thoroughly and permanently established, and that he missed his grandson at a level that made the Missouri winter seem especially pointless. Grace wrote back telling him that there was a piece of land adjacent to theirs that had recently come available, and that she had already inquired about the price. He arrived in October of 1883 with more books than could be transported by a single man in good conscience, and with the expression of someone who has made a decision that was overdue by at least a year, and is relieved to have made it. Walter built him a small separate house over the winter, a proper comfortable house with a sitting room for the books, and Grace Townsend settled into the Guadalupe River Valley with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found exactly where he ought to be. Thomas, who was 2 years old and possessed of the vocabulary and the opinions of someone considerably older, appointed his grandfather his primary source of books and stories, and the particular kind of undivided attention that grandparents provide with a generosity that parents, occupied with the practical business of running a household and a small cattle operation, sometimes cannot match. George was delighted by this arrangement. He was less delighted by Thomas's early and enthusiastic interest in putting things into his grandfather's inkwell, but he adapted. In the spring of 1884, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. She told Walter in the same way she had told him the first time, plainly and after already consulting Dr. Feeney, on the porch in the evening light. He looked at her with the same enormous quiet joy, and then he said, "2 rooms will not be sufficient." "I have already drawn plans for a third," she said, and produced from her apron pocket a folded piece of paper on which she had sketched a proposed addition to the east side of the house with the precision of a woman who has been thinking about it for some time. He looked at the plans and then at her with an expression of profound and helpless affection. "I love you," he said. "You had plans before you told me." "I had plans before I was certain enough to tell anyone," she said. "The plans are good. Look at the window placement." He looked at the window placement. "The window placement is excellent," he said. "Come here." She went. He held her in the spring evening, with the Guadalupe running green below the cedar trees and Thomas's voice audible from the direction of his grandfather's house, engaged in what sounded like an extensive monologue about something important, and the cattle moving in the distance, and the whole long, rich existence of the life they had built together spread out around them. "Are you happy?" he said. He asked this periodically, not because he doubted the answer but because he liked to hear it. She considered it, as she always did, with genuine attention before answering. She thought about the 2 rooms and the 3rd room to come, and the kitchen garden, and the accounts that were accurate and thriving, and her father next door, and Clara Hobbs's visits from Redemption, and the maps that were catastrophically wrong, and the bay mare named Biscuit who was living in comfortable retirement in their barn, and the boy who had inherited both their opinions and both their curiosity, and this man who had given her $40 in 2 years and everything else. "Thoroughly," she said. He pressed his lips to her hair and held on, and the spring evening settled around them like something permanent, like something built to last. The 3rd room was finished in August. The 2nd baby arrived in October of 1884, a girl this time, who came into the world with considerably less drama than Thomas had, but with a quality of calm focus that made Dr. Feeney remark that she appeared to be assessing the situation. "She will be a force," Dr. Feeney said. "They both are," Walter said, looking from his daughter to his son, who was standing at the door of the room with enormous eyes and the expression of someone encountering a change of circumstance that requires thorough evaluation. Thomas eventually decided, after 2 days, that his sister was acceptable and possibly interesting, and thereafter appointed himself her primary explainer of the world, which she tolerated with the calm patience of someone who is listening carefully and drawing her own conclusions. They named her Margaret Helen. Margaret for Walter's mother in Kansas, who was alive and in good health, and had received the news of their marriage and their children with letters that were warm and lengthy and full of questions. Helen for the woman whose disappearance had started everything, the woman Grace had never met but would not forget, the woman whose story had intersected with hers in the dark and had eventually, through Walter Carson's guilt and determination and 2 years of looking, led to something being put right. Walter had been the one to suggest Helen as the middle name. He had suggested it quietly, one evening, and looked at her to see what she thought. "Yes," she had said, without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." The children grew, and the land grew, and the cattle herd grew, carefully and sustainably, with the attention to the numbers that Grace brought to everything. Walter had proven to be exactly the kind of farmer and rancher that his upbringing had shaped him to be, practical and patient and knowledgeable about the land in a way that was not romantic, but was deeply competent. They were not wealthy, not by the standards of the men who were accumulating vast holdings through the particular mechanisms of the era, but they were prosperous in the solid, genuine way of people who have built something real with their own hands and owe it to no one. George Townsend, in his small house next door, became the informal librarian of the Guadalupe River Valley. He organized a small lending arrangement with several neighboring families, transporting books by wagon on a rotating schedule. And by 1886, this had grown, with the assistance of Miss Hartwell, the schoolteacher, into a more formal lending library that operated out of the schoolhouse in Springer's Crossing 2 days a week. Grace managed the accounts for this effort, and Walter built the shelves. In 1887, they received a letter from the estate of Deputy Marshal Aldrich, who had died of a fever in the summer, a letter that enclosed a final accounting of the Vance case. Vance was still in federal prison. He would remain there for many more years. The letter confirmed that all the legal instruments were in order and that no further action would be required. Grace read this letter at the kitchen table with Thomas, who was 6 and could read well enough to follow along over her shoulder. Asking questions she answered honestly and at the appropriate level of detail. Walter sat across the table and watched her with the quiet attention he had never stopped giving her. When she put the letter down, Thomas said, "What does this mean, Mama?" "It means," she said, "that something that needed to be put right was put right, and that some things take a long time, but that the taking of time does not mean they cannot be done." Thomas considered this with the 6-year-old's capacity for unexpected depth. "Papa helped," Thomas said. It was not a question. He had been told, in general terms, the outline of the story, the parts appropriate to his age. "Papa helped," Grace confirmed. "Significantly." Walter looked at his son, and at his wife, and at the kitchen of the house they had built together, and the morning light came through the window Grace had planned onto the table where they sat. And outside, the Guadalupe River ran over its limestone bed in the autumn morning, and Margaret was in the front room making the sounds of someone engaged in an important project, and George Townsend could be heard walking from his house to theirs with the particular rhythm of a man who has somewhere good to be. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Everyone was where they were supposed to be. Grace looked at her husband across the table, and he looked at her. And between them was everything that had happened and everything that had been built, and the whole improbable story that had begun with a gun pointed at a man who had walked through a door and said, "I have been looking for you for 2 years," and she had asked if that was a threat. It had not been a threat. It had been, as it turned out, the most important thing either of them had ever been part of. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers. The morning light came through the window. The river ran over its stones. The children were in the next room, vivid and present and entirely themselves. Everything was right. Everything was home.